Okay, so this is Roman numeral 4, heart contraction. So this is going to cover how the heart actually creates its heartbeat. So the first letter A just speaks about terms when you talk about the heartbeat. So the word systole and diastole describe the heart, whether it's in contraction or relaxation. So you can see from the definition that systole is when the heart muscle is in contraction. So you have atrial systole and ventricular systole. Remember, in the beginning of the lecture, I mentioned that the two atria contract first. So the two atria will be in systole while the ventricles are relaxed and receiving the blood. So the ventricles would be in diastole. And then they're going to switch, right? So then the atria will relax so that they can fill up with blood coming from the body or coming from the lungs. And then the ventricles will contract. So the atria will be in diastole while the ventricles are in systole. So they're going to take turns and they have to be relaxed in order to fill with blood, right? You can't contract a chamber at the same time fill with blood. So they alternate. And the blood pressures that we have, when you have a blood pressure of like 120/80, that refers to these numbers. I want to show you this slide on blood pressure. So what blood pressure is a force against your blood vessel walls, right? So you can see that the arrows are indicating that when your blood is going through your blood vessels, that it's pushing against the sides of the wall, and you're measuring the amount of pressure on the walls of your blood vessels. Remember, your blood vessels are just soft tissue. They're a mix of connective tissue, epithelial cells, some smooth muscle, but they are organic, substances that can tear, they can wear out, they can be stretched. So high blood pressure is bad for those reasons because they can really do a lot of wear and tear on the walls of your blood vessels. So I want to show you what's happening here. So when your heart is in contraction, and you'll hear this a lot when people say when your heart's in contraction, when your heart's in relaxation mode, they're referring to your ventricles, okay? Because the atria are also doing a systolic and diastolic pressure. They are also contracting and relaxing. But when you talk about like blood pressure of your body, right, the systemic circuit, you're really talking about the ventricles contracting. And specifically, you're talking about the left ventricle, because the left ventricle is responsible for pumping the blood to your system. So when you talk about blood pressure, you're really talking about the heart. When the heart is in contraction, it's your ventricles, specifically the left one, right? That should make sense because the left ventricle pumps the blood to your whole body. And so when you're measuring, a blood pressure cuff measures your arm, what you're measuring, and we're going to learn this blood vessel in chapter 22. This is your brachial artery. And the brachial artery is going to be the one that's going to, you're measuring how much force is on the wall there. And you can see that it goes up and down and up and down. And the higher point here is at 120. Okay, so it's measured in millimeters of mercury. So 120, and when it goes down, it's 80, 120, 80, 120, 80. So this is a relatively sort of normal range for a adult blood pressure. The 120 is the higher pressure. So that's the systolic pressure. When your left ventricle is contracting and pushing that blood through the blood vessels, right? That the blood is going to course through faster and more forcefully, pushing along the sides of your blood vessel wall. So that's going to be measured at 120. When the ventricle relaxes for that few moments, then we can see the blood pressure that's measured against the wall is going to fall, right? It falls to about 80. So that 80 is the diastolic pressure. That's when the left ventricle is in relaxation and you're not forcing the blood through anymore. So this is basically it. So you can see that your blood pressure is going to be different at at distances away from the heart. And that should make sense because the blood vessel under the greatest pressure will be the aorta, right? Because the heart's literally just pumping right next door. And then we're going to move, as we move further away, right, we're going to have a little bit lesser and lesser pressure because the farther away from that initial pumping, it's just not going to feel, you have a lot of distance, the blood pressure is going to die. So basically, just understand that we have our systolic pressure, we have our diastolic pressure. The further away you go from the heart, the blood pressure will just drop until you get to the capillaries, very low. But notice the venous pressure. So remember, veins are structures that bring blood towards the heart. So there's no other pump in your body. There's not a pump for the veins, and we'll talk about this in the blood vessels chapter again. But the blood that's traveling in your veins is under very low pressure, right? There's nothing pumping it. It's moving under different forces back towards the heart. So very little pressure in the veins. The blood pressure is going to be measured in the arteries close to the heart, right? That's why we chose the brachial artery. And it drops until it gets to the veins. And the veins are very low pressure vessels. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you. I want you to understand the blood pressure numbers and what they stand for. And then the heartbeat, the sort of onomatopoeia words they use are lub, dup for the heartbeats, for heartbeat. And what you're actually listening to, which might surprise a lot of you guys, that the beat itself is the valves closing. So the shutting of the valves causes such a sort of pounding sound that you can hear it right through your chest. So pretty interesting there. All right, so let's talk about the conduction system. Let me show you this picture back again. So the conduction system is going to be comprised of something called nodal tissue. Nodal tissue is a hybrid of cardiac muscle and basically nervous tissue. So they can generate their own action potential. So this nodal tissue can create its own impulse and then spread that impulse throughout the heart. So let's look at the very first sort of origin of the heartbeat, which is called the sinoatrial node, or the SA node. And the location of this is the upper right atrium. So this is known as the pacemaker of your heart because it initiates your heartbeat. So it'll create that action potential first. Then that sinoatrial node, the impulse, right, will travel through internodal pathways. So I want you to add this to your outline because it's not actually written down there. So internodal pathways to both sides, because remember, both of our atria contract first. So both of our atria get the electrical signal first. It's generated on the right side. So there's a little lag before the left side, but not super significant. So we're going to have both of our atria contract, getting the messages through our internodal pathways. That message, the impulse, is going to then coalesce here at the atrioventricular node. So we have a second node, an AV node. The AV node will then generate an impulse and send it down our interventricular septum. So remember, this piece of tissue here between the two ventricles is called the interventricular septum. And the pathway of nodal tissue is called a bundle. So there's two terms for this. You can call it the atrioventricular bundle, or its older term, the bundle of His, HIS. So we have two bundles, left and right. So the bundles will travel down here, down the septum. And then once it reaches the apex of the heart, the bundles will spread up the walls of the ventricles. When it starts to spread up the walls, they're called Purkinje fibers. Okay. Now, there is a little offshoot here. There's an offshoot to the right ventricle, and this is called the moderator band. Okay. This is a structure that you can actually see when you dissect the heart. You can see a piece of, it looks like a piece of the heart wall, but it doesn't look textured like the trabecula carne we talked about. It looks very smooth, and so it doesn't look exactly the same as the rest of the heart. Unfortunately, you can't see this on your own, or but by with the real heart, but I'll try and find a video that shows that. Okay. So we covered all of the conduction system here, right? So the firing goes SA node, AV node, and then between the two, our internodal pathways take the message to our atria, down our bundle of His to the Purkinje fibers, and then we have our moderator band going to the right. All right, so I wanted to ask you a question here. Will the heart beat outside the body? I'm going to show you this. I'll put the link up to the modules. I usually show this in class, but this is a video of a person who, just a random YouTube video, but it's a person who cut out a turtle's heart, and he's holding the turtle's heart in his palm, and it's beating. And you can see that there's two tiny atria at the top, and then the most of the heart, the bulk of the heart is the ventricles, and you can see them alternate beating. So if you feel like you can handle that kind of imagery, I'll put this up so you can watch it. And I'll also put this is just a conduction system animation, which is just a little visual tutorial if you wanted to. If you're a visual learner and you want to see it, I'll put those two links up on the module. So let's look at the next slide here. So can you mediate the heartbeat? Can you make it faster or slower? And of course you can, right? We can all feel when we get excited, our heartbeat goes a little faster, and when we're calm, the heartbeat slows down. So on top, so the nodal system here is responsible for sort of a regular heartbeat. So I think it's every 0.85 seconds. Yes. The pacemaker or the SA node fires an action potential and it spreads throughout the heart. So that's going to maintain a regular heartbeat. You can speed up or slow down your heart rate because we have nervous system, right? The nerves will travel to the heart and stimulate the heart to either slow down or to speed up. And so remember this, right? Our sympathetic fibers, if we have sympathetic fibers active and they are reaching the heart, then it's going to speed up the heart, right? This is your fight or flight response. And I just want to point out the details here because really this looks very, very complicated, but look what you guys know. You know that the fibers are going to travel, from your spinal cord. Look at this guy. This is your sympathetic ganglion, right? Remember we had our sympathetic neurons there, and our sympathetic neurons will then travel to the heart to speed up our heart rate. So you can see the pathway as it reaches the heart. And then these parasympathetic fibers this is your rest and digest fibers, right? Those are going to slow down your heart rate. And if you guys remember your vagus nerve. This is the nerve, your cranial nerve 10, that travels from the brain stem down, right? So we're traveling down, 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 and this innervates all of our viscera in our thoracic cavity and our abdominal pelvic cavity. So you guys know this stuff, which is pretty neat, right? So let's see. True or false? I answered this. If sympathetic fibers are active, it will increase the heart rate. So that is a true statement. Okay. All right, so let's look at this. For some people, their SA node does not fire on a regular basis, and sometimes it misfires, or it skips a beat, or it stops working, right? And all those scenarios are really dangerous because you need to, of course, have a regular heartbeat to live. And so for people whose SA node has been shown to be ineffective or not functional, they can wear a pacemaker. So this is an artificial pacemaker. It's a device that's implanted in a person's chest, and it can detect when there is an irregular heartbeat. And it will basically act as a defibrillator. So it will zap an electrical signal or electrical impulse through the body, and that electrical jolt will knock the heart back into a regular heartbeat. So this is your artificial pacemaker. So your pacemaker being the SA node, if your SA node doesn't work, this is an external SA node. A story that I heard from a student years ago said that her father does have a pacemaker, and she was holding her father's hand when it went off, and she could feel the electrical shock from her father. So she got shocked by holding his hand because our bodies conduct electricity. I just thought that was really interesting. All right, so we talked about modification of the heartbeat, and let's take a look at our echocardiogram, our ECG or EKG. So an interesting story here. Echocardiogram was invented in Germany, where they spell cardio with a K, but of course we spell cardio with a C. So we call it ECG, other places call it EKG, same thing. All right, so physiology will teach you how to read the waves here. I'm not going to go into that, but you want to know just some terms associated with an ECG. This is the electrical signals that are coming from the heart. Okay, so from the atria and from the ventricles. When you look at a normal heart rate, right, this is what a normal rate and rhythm looks like. You can tell by the electrical signals coming from the heart, and you can read this out right on the ECG, that you can have a lot of different irregularities, and you can see them by their impulses. So I want you guys to know that tachycardia is a faster than normal heartbeat. I want you to know that bradycardia is a slower than normal heartbeat, except I don't have bradycardia on this picture. So you don't need to recognize them, just know the terms. And then fibrillation is an irregular heartbeat. So if you look at an example of ventricular fibrillation, right, this is where the ventricles are, so this peak, this really high peak, that's when the ventricles contract. That's not there, right? So this person is basically having a heart attack because their ventricles are not contracting. So fibrillation is can be irregular, it can be uncoordinated, it can be a rapid heartbeat, and this is why we call the panels that we use a defibrillator, because a very large shock of electrical signal can actually reset the SA node and hopefully get that heart back into a regular heartbeat. Okay, so let's look at blood supply to the heart. So when we look at blood supply to the heart, we already looked at two of these blood vessels. So right from the very first contraction into the aorta, the heart is taking blood for itself, right? So we have the right coronary artery coming off the ascending aorta and the left coronary artery also coming off the ascending aorta or branching off of the ascending aorta. Let's follow the right side, right? So the right coronary artery is going to travel down in that sulcus, and then it'll have one major branch coming into the right ventricle. So this is called the marginal artery. You want to recognize that. The marginal artery is going to supply the right ventricle, obviously, right? Because it's located here. Marginal is because it sits on the margin or the edge, right, of the heart. So there it is. The right coronary artery is going to follow so basically just continue on to the posterior heart. And look what it does. It actually meets up with the left side. So let's follow the left side, right? We have their left coronary artery here that's behind our pulmonary trunk. The left coronary artery comes, you can see it, a little bit of it, and then it's going to split. So you need to understand that blood vessels, when they branch, they change names. Okay, so the branching here, the branch that runs down the anterior surface of the heart, this is called the anterior interventricular artery. Very descriptive because where it runs is between the ventricles. It just sits right between the ventricles here. The other branch is called circumflex, and the circumflex is going to follow the left side of the heart in that sulcus between the atrium and ventricle, and then continue to the posterior heart. Now, the right coronary artery and the circumflex artery, they meet up, right? So this junction of the blood vessels is branched, and this is called an anastomosis. So you want to know the anastomosis word. It's a junction of your blood vessels. We also see that the posterior side, there's going to be a branch coming down off the right coronary artery again, and this is called the posterior interventricular artery, right? We have an anterior and posterior artery, the same name, and that's going to join up in an anastomosis with our anterior side. So we can see that the left and right sides of the heart are connected, and the anterior and posterior sides of the heart are connected. Okay, so these are the major blood vessels. I want to show you the veins, and then we'll see an actual picture of the heart. So the veins, these are the major veins of the heart. And notice that the arteries are called coronary arteries, but the veins are called cardiac veins. Don't ask me why. So the major cardiac veins that you want to be able to identify in a diagram is our number one, the great cardiac vein. So the great cardiac vein is going to follow the same, it's going to be right next to the anterior interventricular artery. So arteries and veins and nerves, you guys, will run together through the body. So on the heart, you don't have nerves wrapping the heart, but you have arteries and veins are traveling together. So right next to our anterior interventricular artery is our great cardiac vein, right? So the great cardiac vein is on the anterior surface. Remember, our posterior interventricular artery, well, right next to that is going to be something called the middle cardiac vein, okay? And then remember our marginal artery, right next to that will be our small cardiac vein, right? So we have great, middle, and small. So all of this is a small cardiac vein. And then we have two little veins here. These are called anterior cardiac veins that drain directly into the right atrium. And this is mentioned in the very first portion of this lecture when I said, like, what are the four vessels that drain into the right atrium? These were one of those four. Okay, so let's follow the flow. So remember, veins are draining blood back into the right atrium, right? So blood comes into the small cardiac vein and moves towards this area here. This is called the coronary sinus. This is another vessel that drains right into the right atrium. The blood coming from the posterior heart is going to drain up also into the coronary sinus. Blood draining from the anterior heart will follow the great cardiac vein and then also converge onto the coronary sinus before moving into the right atrium. Okay, so you just want to recognize these larger veins, the larger arteries, but realize that the heart is quite extensive in its blood supply. So we just learned the really, really big ones, right? And then there are medium-sized ones. There's tiny ones that we can't see. They're microscopic, right? So the heart is very well vascularized. It has to have a constant supply of oxygen and blood to work. And if you cut off that blood supply, it's a problem, right? It can be a heart attack or it can be an angina attack. So I'm going to stop here and we'll talk about coronary artery disease in the next segment.